Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 95, and today I'm in conversation with Ariel Sabar. Ariel Sabar is the author of Veritas, a Harvard professor, a conman, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. It's something I reviewed in the most recent episode of the NT Pod and something that I've been interested in for some years. It's an absolute pleasure today to be interviewing Ariel Sabar for this podcast. I hope that you enjoy it. Well, I'm delighted to have as a guest on the NT Pod today, the author of the wonderful new book, Veritas. That is Ariel Sabar. Now, he's an author who is already familiar to regular listeners to the NT Pod because I've talked a lot about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And this wonderful new book is an absolute, I'll just say this right from the get-go, it's an absolute must-read for anybody interested in Christian origins, in forgeries, in the state of the discipline, and so on. So very warm welcome, Ariel, to my podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And if I could just underline to me, before we talk about some of the substance, just how much I enjoyed this book. I read somebody else saying online that this was the first book they'd read from cover to cover since the pandemic started.
Oh,
and
nice.
I read that and I thought, do you know, that's true of me as well. I mean, I've read lots of bits and pieces of things, but this is a genuine page turner. I didn't miss a bit of it, and I read all the footnotes as well. So many congratulations on a wonderful read.
I appreciate it.
How has the reaction to it been? I mean, it's been out now for a couple of weeks or so. Have you been pleased with the way that people have responded?
Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting to see the range of reactions and just the number of reviewers who've decided to review it has been really overwhelming. I didn't expect, quite so many newspapers and magazines to take the kind of interest in it as they have, and that's been really gratifying. Always, as an author, there's a fear that you write something and it sort of, you drop it into the void and never, no one sort of reacts to it. And so it was gratifying after spending, several years, full-time shoe leather reporting this really complex story with all these moving parts and, characters all over the world to see it enter the world was really
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing. It is actually a very complex story. And going into it, I thought, how on earth is Sabar going to unravel all the different elements to this? Because it meanders in and out of academia to investigative journalism to porn sites. I mean, how you tell that story and do it coherently. I mean, it must have been a bit of a challenge to work out, for a start, just how to structure the thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this for me, and I am not an academic, I'm a journalist. I use somewhat different methods. And so certainly in writing a book for a general audience, I was very conscious of making sure that, we had all the elements of a great read. Clearly, this was a work of investigative journalism. I and my foreign language interpreters interviewed something like 450 people. There was a lot of documents research, archival research, looking at public records in Europe and the United States. But then once you've gathered all of that material, you have to decide how to present it to a range of readers, ranging from scholars like you, Dr. Goodacre, who know just about everything there is to know about the New Testament and the apocryphal Gospels and early Christianity, and then to people who, have never read the New Testament, who may not be particularly religious, who may not follow biblical scholarship, and how do you present it in a way that respects everybody's intelligence, but also is entertaining? I mean, I'm not writing a scholarly tome. I'm writing a book that I want people to feel like, I want to find out what happens next. I want to get to the next chapter. And so I felt like structure was the best way to do that, where you have this sort of mystery at the beginning of this sensational new discovery of a papyrus fragment in which Jesus appears to utter the words, "my wife," for the first time in recorded history. And then, we see that unravel very quickly at the beginning. So we have this mystery. How could something presented to the world by such an acclaimed institution, by such a respected scholar, so quickly unravel. And so it's almost like finding the dead body at the beginning of a detective story.
Right.
The rest of the story is sort of unraveling that mystery. And so
Yeah.
that's why I sort of tried to approach it as a sort of storytelling exercise.
Yeah, and I think it really works because, I mean, I didn't know going in when you would introduce Walter Fritz, who is this character who turns out to be the owner of the fragment. And actually, even though he's there as a shadowy character in the earlier chapters, he really only comes in and his full story in Act 4 of the piece, doesn't it? So one's gone through over half of the book before one's really got to the in a way, right, the center of the intrigue. Not that the acts 1 to 3 aren't in their own way absolutely fascinating. I mean, that must have been a difficult thing to have done without putting all of your cards on the table in chapter 1.
Yeah, no, that's a great craft question that as a writer, I love answering these. Yeah, it was tricky because clearly Walter Fritz winds up being a major character in the story. He is, as you said, the owner of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment, someone with a very interesting past. And, the question was, well, part of it, one reason I don't introduce him until sort of midway through the narrative is that that's sort of true to life. I mean, he was a shadowy figure, this faceless man who Dr. Karen King of Harvard Divinity School refused to identify. Scholars, journalists had asked from day one, hey, who is this individual that brought you this small scrap of papyrus? And she wouldn't say. And so in many respects, he was a mystery figure for the world for all those years. So it felt consistent with that. And I think the other question that we wrestled with was, how do we sort of introduce him at key moments earlier without identifying him? And that was, we couldn't fully leave him out. We needed there to be some sense that there was this kind of shadowy figure, mysterious, somewhat enigmatic, that you needed to sort of know existed, but you didn't need to know a whole lot about him because most people didn't. So there are a few places where, we sort of, you see him, you hear him, but you don't see him.
Right.
And that's, of course, in the prologue of the book, where there's this kind of set piece where we look at Dr. King's where we start with Dr. King's presentation at the International Congress of Coptic Studies in Rome in 2012, where she announces the discovery, and then we sort of flash back a few months to Walter Fritz's visit to the Divinity School, although we do not know at that point that it's Walter Fritz.
And there was something new there for me, which in that prologue where Fritz is actually pointing to things in Harvard's architecture, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's part of his. He fashions himself as sort of intellectual, someone who, for whom any piece of art or architecture is part of his store of knowledge. And to his credit, he's very, very well read. I mean, he reads a lot. He's very bright. He's a really astute reader of human psychology. So he's finally sort of made it into, the temple, if you will. He's made it into Harvard Divinity School. He's got this amazing piece of papyrus, he believes, or rather he says. And here he is hanging out with Dr. Karen King, the Hollis Professor of Divinity at Harvard, in this sort of cool room in the Harvard Divinity School library. Where amazingly there are these stained glass pennants. I forget what the proper term for them is, but they came out of sort of private churches in I think medieval or Renaissance Europe, and he's sort of commenting on them in ways that are really sort of fascinating. So and those were details I was able to pick out both from interviews with Walter Fritz, but also from emails that were shared with me, not by Walter Fritz, in which he tries to sort of impress Dr. King with his ability to read kind of like Gothic German. So it's really fascinating way that we were able to introduce him early on as a kind of mystery man without telling.
Yeah, I love that. And it slightly puts the lie, doesn't it, straight off the bat to the idea that he's some kind of family man that lives near, likes going to Disney World and doesn't know anything about this stuff. I mean, that already, to me, is like a warning sign at the beginning of the book. This guy is not all that he might seem to be. Right. Or at least, or in a way, he's more than he might seem to be.
Sure. And I think as a narrative, as a storytelling device, again, readers needed to have a sense. We wrestled with this a little bit. How do you want to do a little bit of foreshadowing, but not too much. You always want to withhold. I mean, that's a sort of a golden rule of storytelling is you want to withhold as much as possible so that the readers are curious. But
Mm-hmm.
in a book like this, we felt there needed to be a little bit of foreshadowing of who Walter
Mm-hmm.
Fritz was. And that was the sort of small way in which we did that.
Yeah, I thought it really worked, because then, one goes to September, and the wonderful thing about the book is this, I mean, it's not fortuitous, because I suppose it's the very thing that made you so interested in it, but that you're there. And in many respects, you are the primary journalist of this. I mean, there's Lisa Wangsness from Boston Globe, and there's Laurie Goldstein from Goodstein, that's right, Goodstein from New York Times. But you were the one who, so I mean, all three of you kind of broke the story, but you were the only one who was there in Rome when Karen King reveals this fragment. I was going to say to the world, but I mean to a small gathering of Coptic experts. That is, I mean, even it actually made my, I mean, I wasn't there, although I have many friends who were there, but it actually made my flesh of tingle a little bit, thinking, living into this moment, especially if you have this extraordinary anticlimax that Karen King doesn't have the pictures. I didn't know that detail. I mean, so she's presenting a new fragment to the world and there's no pictures.
Yeah. So just to sort of contextualize this for your listeners, this was September 18th, 2012. And I was a freelance journalist for Smithsonian Magazine. And as you said, there were three publications that got sort of advance access to Dr. King and the fragment. And the New York Times and the Boston Globe did their stories without going to Rome. I was the only journalist that actually went to Rome and was in the room at this Coptic conference when Dr. King presented her finding. And it was strange. She had told me the day before that her laptop had broken on the flight from Boston to Rome. And so she didn't have her pictures. She was gonna have to reconstruct some of her talk. And, I sort of, part of me wondered, Harvard has this website that's ready to go live, that's loaded with great images of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. In the 3 intervening days between her laptop breaking down and her talk, why couldn't Harvard have emailed her those photos? Her colleague, Anne-Marie Leyendyke, another very well-respected scholar at Princeton University, told me that she also had photos on her computer. She was in the room, but that Dr. King had not asked her for those. So in retrospect, I think, some scholars are raising some questions about why photos of this new, really important discovery would not have been shown to her colleagues at the moment of announcement. And because Dr. King, is an interpreter of text, and she's great at, she's great at sort of wading into these fragmentary, cryptic, only partially surviving texts and really wrenching meaning from them in some really interesting and creative ways. And she really wanted her talk to focus on that. One of the outcomes of not showing a photograph, whether intentional or not, and I can't read her mind, but whether intentional or not showing a photograph meant that the top scholars of Coptic, the top scholars of Coptic language, papyrology, paleography, the study of ancient handwriting, did not have an opportunity to use all of the skills that they're trained to use to assess the question of authenticity. Because before you can interpret something, typically you need to decide whether it's real or not. And I think Dr. King, because of her expertise being in more of as a textual analyst, she sort of skipped, not showing a photograph allowed her, again, intentionally or not, sort of skip over that test of actually showing the object to the top people in the field and letting them weigh in on the question of authenticity. So what winds up happening is, as you know from the book, is that very quick, that question of authenticity doesn't really happen in the room. It happens later. And the debate that happens in the room is whether Dr. King's interpretation of the fragment is accurate.
But there was definitely a kind of skeptical reaction in the room. Is that fair to say? I picked that up from the book, that it's not like everybody is wowing this thing in the sense of, oh my goodness, what a find. There's more of a sense I pick up from your reporting that people are saying, wait a minute, hold on a minute. And it's more that kind of reaction. Is that fair?
Yeah, and it's, for the most part, it's skeptical. It's not, people are raising questions about what comes after the fragmentary words, my wife. So the middle line of the papyrus, smack dead center in the papyrus, is the partial phrase, Jesus said to them, my wife. But because it's a fragment missing its margins on its top, its bottom, and its left and right sides, we really don't know what comes, if this were an authentic fragment, what would come before or after this. So there are even questions of how that sentence, my wife, would have ended.
Right.
And if you wanted to go really, really geek out, the top one of the top Coptic linguists in the world, Ariel Sabar, formerly of Hebrew University, actually raised the question of whether the Coptic word hime even means wife. That seems to be a pretty settled question in Coptic. But there, even at the level of like basic language, there were sharp questions being raised by top people in her field. And my sense, and as I report in the book, I tape recorded the digitally recorded the talk, so you can be assured that what you're hearing is the actual talk. She was eager to get out of there. That once the Q&A started, even though there were many minutes left before the Augustinianum, the location of the talk, was about to close, she was really eager to sort of wrap things up. I don't think she felt particularly comfortable, and perhaps none of us would, seeing something that we had spent a lot of time invested in, sharply questioned.
I mean, we've all,
not an easy place to be.
No, absolutely, and we've all academics have had that experience of being in a conference room and giving a paper that is not going as well as you hoped it would. So you really kind of live that with her through the piece. I mean, if I might ask just a kind of a general question about since it's come up, a question about Karen King in the book. It must have been difficult to know exactly how to pitch the discussion of Karen King, because I think what does come out is that she is a really highly respected, very important scholar that's done hugely important work in the field on Gnosticism, on women in Christian origins, on a range of things. But at the same time, to know that you can't approach this without having some degree of criticism of the way that she handled things. And of course, hindsight's 20/20 and so on. Was that, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the difficulty of how you approach Walter Fritz as the owner, but I mean, in some respects, I imagine that how to discuss Karen King's involvement was an even more natty problem.
Yeah, and look, I always write about, I guess from the time I started, as a journalist, I always feel like you have to portray people in three dimensions. Fundamentally, we're all human beings, and any journalist who does not capture the humanity of their subjects I think it's malpractice. You have to really seek to understand a human being. And it's not easy, and I'm not claiming to have done it well or necessarily perfectly, definitely not perfectly, and clearly other people would read each of these characters differently. But I did spend a lot of time traveling to the hometowns of both Walter Fritz and Karen King, speaking to in both cases to their mothers, to their childhood friends, to relatives, to colleagues who knew them at every stage of their career, to really make sure that no one viewed either of them as either somehow a terrible person or a flawless person. They are like all of us, a mixture of good qualities and sometimes not so great qualities. And I really tried to capture that in both of them. I'm also sensitive to the fact that I really feel like people should not read this as a knock on certain kinds of scholarship. Like it's not a knock on. It shouldn't be taken as a knock at all on the wonderful scholarship of women in early Christianity. It should not be taken, I think, to read it as a knock on feminist scholarship would be to deliberately misread the book. There's a lot of great, wonderful scholarship by Dr. King and others on, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, on women in early Christianity, and there's a lot of great evidence for women leaders in early Christianity, and there's a lot of great feminist scholarship. And I think what makes this story interesting is that this particular discrete story is an exception, I think, to that great evidence and to that great scholarship. So how and why do things go wrong here? And so I think it's a mistake. I mean, what makes it a great story is that in some ways it's not representative. And how does it, what are the forces that lead this person in this particular case so seemingly far off track? And that's what sort of interested me as a reporter and writer.
And I must admit, I appreciated in particular the way that you didn't pitch this story in a way that I think some scholars have tried to do as a battle between feminist scholars and more intransigent, mainly male sexist evangelical scholars, because there's a story that you can kind of tell, given that some of the major writers who were exposing the forgery were card-carrying evangelicals.
Sure.
But as you realize, that many simply aren't. I mean, and
Sure.
including, Andrew Bernhard, who plays a major role in your narrative, is not an evangelical scholar. Frankly, I don't know what his religious beliefs are. I don't think he talks about them, as far as I'm aware. And many of the other characters in the piece, it's either irrelevant what their background is for their discussions, or it's simply unknown. So I appreciated you not pitching it in that way as a kind of culture wars narrative, even though there is obviously a kind of culture wars dynamic to this, which frankly, as someone that lived through this, that was one of the most difficult things to navigate, because I realized that, being a white male scholar writing about this topic, in which I'm saying from very early on, I think this thing's a forgery, does actually make nuancing that discussion much harder, frankly. So I appreciated the way you didn't pitch it as a battle between those.
I mean, I think that's a good point. And I think I tried to say, look, there are these larger battles in biblical studies, and it would be a mistake to ignore them. Clearly, and I talk a good deal about, the evangelical billionaire owners of Hobby Lobby, and they've also been, rooked even worse in many ways, by forgeries and looted archaeological objects. So part of what I try to do is say, look, you can't really, neither side can really weaponize this against the other. It's really, you can be a wealthy white evangelical billionaire male who owns Hobby Lobby, or you can be a more progressive, feminist, highly respected scholar like Dr. King, and all of us at either end of the spectrum could be vulnerable to a con artist. And so I was less interested, and no, I talk about it, and sort of I have to talk about the culture war that's happening in parts of biblical scholarship. I thought it would be a mistake to foreground it, because what it would do is it would get us into this place that I think is a really dangerous place, and one where in some ways we find ourselves now as a country, in which all of us have our own all of us have our own truths, and there's no sort of middle ground. And so my truth is that the papyrus says this and it's authentic. Another person's truth is that it's fake and it doesn't say this, and therefore it's impossible to know. And I think there's a book about Russian disinformation called something like "Everything is Possible and Nothing is True." And I think that's a really dangerous place to be. And so what I wanted to showcase is that yes, there is a culture war. However, it certainly touched on this saga in important ways. But if you were trying to discredit arguments using culture war arguments, then that's where you're failing. You need to use academic, scholarly, or in some cases journalistic techniques to try to approach the truth of whether this thing is authentic or not. And for me, that was critical. And in sort of saying, look, yes, we all have our prejudices, we all have our ideologies,
right.
But in the end, those can't be the basis for determining whether a piece of the ancient world is authentic or not.
No, right, absolutely. I mean, did you going back to the beginning again, 2012? So I reread this morning, just to give myself some context, your Smithsonian article from back in September 2012. And that was a really important resource for lots of us going on. And because, in part, because the provenance story that you tell there is a bit more detailed than the one that was officially released. So we get to find out a little bit more already back then. So looking at it now with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that you're already asking some of the really key questions right off the bat. Did you then, between September 2012 and when you started investigating a bit more thoroughly the provenance and looking for Fritz and so on, did you follow the debate as it unraveled? Were you kind of, looking at blogs and news reports and things like that? Did it remain something, or was it just percolating away in the background for you? I'm interested to know at what stage it became a live issue again for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a freelancer, so I filed that Smithsonian story both for the web and then a revised one a month later for the print magazine, the Smithsonian magazine, with some reaction from colleagues, Elaine Pagels, top Coptic scholars, the Vatican. And then after I followed those stories, I'm a freelancer, so I moved on to other projects. But this was one that really stuck with me. I mean, how often is it that, an editor calls you up and says, you need to drop everything, get on a plane tomorrow to Harvard, and then in a couple weeks, fly to Rome, where a major Harvard scholar is going to announce the gospel of Jesus' wife. I mean, I've had some pretty, I've traveled the world as a journalist, and I've been fortunate to be able to do that. But this was up there in terms of, really just thrilling assignments, and one where I felt like you were at the center of something that was going to be a topic of great discussion. So it did stay with me. And what I do with a lot of my stories, and really as soon as I start reporting stories, I set up Google alerts around a lot of keywords. Whether it's Jesus' wife papyrus fragment, Karen King fragment, papyrus, just lots of different ones. And I don't turn them off. So even after I filed a story, those continue to flow in every few days, and they kind of keep me on top of where the story is. And so periodically I'd sort of check in on where sort of the lay of the land was, and saw that there had been some scientific tests conducted, that there was a Harvard Theological Review did finally publish Dr. King's article after about a year and a half. And then I saw that there was an entire issue of New Testament studies with papers by scholars who were questioning the authenticity of the Jesus' wife papyrus. So I noticed that there was still a sort of a robust debate, and that clearly the weight of the evidence and sort of the majority of scholars had by 2015 were leaning very strongly on the idea that this was a forgery. But there were still a few people, not many, who were willing to sort of give Dr. King the benefit of the doubt.
I mean,
so that's when I decided to come back in and write this story for The Atlantic magazine that looked at this one unresolved question, and that was the unresolved question of provenance. Where did this small scrap of papyrus come from? And that had been there from the very start. That had been there from day one when I got the Smithsonian assignment. This question of like, who is Dr. King's source? Such a basic question for journalists. Like, sources are everything in journalism. If you can't trust your source, you don't have a story. And there's another journalists will knock one another. It's a very rookie move. It's something a cub reporter might do their first year or two on the job, which is what's known as a one source story. If you have a one source story, you are really on thin ice, because it means that your entire story that's going to appear in print and be circulated to, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of readers, depending on who you write for, is resting on a single source. And in many ways, what Dr. King had with the Gospel of Jesus' wife was a one source story. Her only source for where it had come from, and what it and whose hands it had passed through, and what it might even be, was a complete stranger. The man named Walter Fritz. She wouldn't say a lot about him when we first spoke in 2012, but I did ask her, is this someone who you've known before? Is this a collector whose name people in the field of antiquities collecting or book collecting would recognize? And she said, no, complete stranger. So Dr. King essentially had a one source story that rested on the word of a complete stranger who did not want to be identified. And I think as a journalist, I knew that was a risky place to be.
Now, fascinating. And some of what you, I mean, it's such a fascinating read, because some of what you discovered is basically easy stuff that anyone could have done. Although whenever I see that in scholarship, I always say to myself, well, yeah, but did you do it? I mean, lots of people say, well, I could have done that. So yeah, but you didn't, did you? But I mean, one thing that I was kicking myself about is when you look up when you follow through this guy and see that he'd registered the Gospel of Jesus Wife.com in August 2012, something like that.
Yes,
I mean, any of us sitting at our desk could have done that without having to travel to Florida or Germany or wherever else. So that one actually made me smile a little bit, because there were a few of us. I mean, I don't credit myself with this at all, but I did know of others who were kind of on the trail of Walter Fritz. I mean, there was nothing like the where you'd got to with it, but I mean, it was something. He was somebody who was already being whispered about back in 2015. And in fact, one thing I wanted to ask you about is I did go back and I reread some of my own blog posts, and Owen Jarvis in Live Science had done some good stuff, I thought, on provenance already in 2014,
Yes,
which was setting things up. I mean, did some of those things help you to say, okay, there really is a story to tell here, to investigate?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know if I said this before, but right after, even while reporting the Smithsonian story, I had basically like 3 weeks to go from like knowing almost nothing about early Christianity and the New Testament. I was raised Jewish. This wasn't part of my own tradition. So I had to read, to understand the New Testament, I had to understand apocryphal Gospels. I had to understand a little bit about Coptic. I had to interview Dr. King, Dr. Roger Bagnall, and Dr. Anne-Marie Leindyke, and then produce a 6,000-word story on deadline that was, publishable and fact-checked. So even in spite of all that, I did not get a lot of sleep in those 3 weeks. I did try to ask some questions about provenance even then. So this guy, Hans Ulrich Laukamp, you don't see this in my Smithsonian piece because there just simply wasn't room and I didn't have anything solid then. But I started talking to some people who knew collectors, and they're like, never heard of this guy, Hans Ulrich Laukamp. Now, Hans Ulrich Laukamp, for listeners who may not know, is the individual who allegedly owned it before Walter Fritz. So Walter Fritz told Karen King that he had purchased it from Hans Ulrich Laukamp. Dr. King did not identify Walter Fritz, but she was willing to identify this man, Hans Ulrich Laukamp. So I already started trying to figure out, is there anyone who knows who this guy is? And the answer I got back, even in 2012, was never heard of him. And it turns out that, from everybody who all of his friends, relatives said he never collected papyri, never owned papyri. He was a tool maker with an 8th grade education. So already in 2012, I'm getting responses from people that say that this Hans Ulrich Laukamp is not someone who is a known collector. And then the other discovery I made, even in 2012, actually right after I filed my Smithsonian piece, because I was interested in sources even then, was to discover that there was a Hans Ulrich Laukamp who lived in Venice, Florida, for a time. So this was in 2012 that I already made that discovery.
Okay, interesting.
I didn't feel like I had enough then. And again, as a freelancer, it's not like you can go back and say, hey, I've got a follow-up story I want to do. And they're like, what, 500-word story that you have a question about this guy? It's not enough. There's a very high bar for high-level magazines for what will warrant a story. So even in 2012, I realized there's a guy, and I think I even may have I wrote to his son-in-law in Germany because I noticed that he appeared on a Florida public document. And I said, hey, is Hans Ulrich Laukamp your relative? And is there any chance that he ever collected papyri? I never got a response. And so that's where I kind of left it. And then, yes, you're right. And Owen Jarvis deserves credit for really asking in print, raising some of the first questions about whether the Hans Ulrich Laukamp story could withstand scrutiny. And he wrote some important stories for Live Science, I think 2014 and 2015, where some of the people like that same individual who didn't respond to my email in 2012, I think Owen speaks a little bit of German. And so the son-in-law responded to him and said, yeah, no, that doesn't sound right. So certainly Owen's work helped confirm for me some of the questions I had back in 2012, and I had already begun researching back in 2012 about whether this Laukamp guy was truly ever an owner of this papyrus.
Because one of the things that made me really suspicious is a detail that's in your Smithsonian article, which it's surprising that this wasn't a red flag to more people. Clearly, the fact you mention it means that it was already a red flag to you, but there are actually 2 separate stories about the provenance. One that Laukamp got this thing in the 1960s, and then it emerges later, well, it'd been in his family's possession prior to World War II. And you're thinking, well, hold on, which one of these is it? I mean, I remember talking to Andrew Bernhard about this, having read your article, and well, that's like a pretty important contradiction there, isn't it? Did he have it did he purchase it in 1963, was it supposed to be? Or had he had it since before the war? I mean, that was flabbergasting to me.
That was one of the things that started raising questions. Again, to her credit, Dr. King, after it didn't happen right away, but I asked her so many times to share the emails back and forth between her and the collector in 2012. And it took some convincing, but eventually she allowed me, she basically cut and pasted the text from the emails between 2010 and 2012 where Walter Fritz is courting her. Now, I had no idea it was Walter Fritz then. She cut out all the identifying information, no metadata, no email addresses, no names, no location. She basically did a very thorough scrub. But that back and forth between con man and scholar, to me, wound up being a really important resource when I went back to this story. While it didn't tell me who he was, it did show me precisely what you're talking about, which is like all these dates keep slipping. So they have this like 1.5 year email conversation. And like each time Walter Fritz tells the story, the dates change, not necessarily by a lot. The example you mentioned is probably the greatest shift. One is 1963, one is from before World War II. So those are very different, but there seem to be like slight alterations in the date every time he tells the story of when he acquired the papyrus from Hans Ulrich Laukamp. And I think that there's, what he's doing, again, you're really seeing the gears turning inside Walter Fritz's head, in my view, which is that he is working out all of the various permutations of how his story might be falsifiable. And he's learning. He's realizing, well, you know what? There is that public document out there that says I didn't actually live in this house on the date when I supposedly bought it from him. So, let me see if I can rethink that date. If I move it 2 years forward or back, it might work a little bit better. So you can see like the gears turning. Again, this is my view. You can see the gears turning in Walter Fritz's head. How can I calibrate this just so that if anybody does start asking questions about provenance, I'm sort of protected. And so, the slipperiness with the dates was one of the things right away that said something's up here.
Right, absolutely. Did you? I mean, as one reads the story of your investigation, it kind of unravels in a kind of getting clearer and clearer and clearer that you've got the right person. But I assume that the reality, like all these things, is that sometimes it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Did you at any point during that think, oh my goodness, this is just exhausting? I mean, for example, you tell in some detail in the book about how when you first approached Walter Fritz with everything you'd got, he just flat out denied things, right? I mean, correct. So I mean, at that stage, that must have been a crunch point for you as someone that had already invested a huge amount of time and energy on researching this story.
Yeah, I mean, that was at the relatively near the beginning, before I even had the assignment for Smithsonian Magazine. Again, because of the high bar of writing for a place like the Smithsonian Magazine or the Atlantic, you can't sort of come with them with like a half-baked idea. You really have to do your research to make sure you have a credible proposal. And so I did fly myself out to Florida back in 2015, showed up at Fritz's house, but I'm not afraid of knocking on strangers' doors, but I couldn't even get to the door. There was a big fence, there was a no trespassing sign, there was a bull mastiff that was sort of staring at me from the other side of the fence, and there appeared to be no bell. So I went back to my hotel and I called Walter, and he denied, as you said, he denied everything. And so it was clear, but it was also clear to me that he was, the reaction, you can tell someone's by tone of voice when you broach certain things, that the reaction was a little bit, it raised some questions. He claimed he didn't know anything about it, but when I asked if he was the owner, his voice kind of rose an octave, and he's like, "No, who told you that?" It's sort of like this weird, like very pressured response that you wouldn't expect if someone. Again, that's not enough to go on, but I felt like I knew that there was a Walter Fritz who had studied Egyptology, who had written a 1991 article for an Egyptology journal. I had no idea whether it was the same one. It seemed ridiculous to think that they were, because here you have a Walter Fritz in Florida who works for an auto parts company. And then you have another Walter Fritz 2 decades earlier who wrote a story for an Egyptology journal. And anyone who's been to Germany knows that Walter Fritz is a very, very common name. There are hundreds of Walter Fritzes in Germany. There are even 9 or 10 in Florida. Wow. So none of this was dispositive. But it's frustrating because you have in an ideal scenario, the source tells you everything and you got your story, but that's not really how it usually works. Not with people who know what they're, not with someone who's trying to deceive and knows what they're doing. So it became very clear to me that I needed to actually go out and gather facts, gather documentary evidence. And Walter Fritz wasn't going to tell me anything until I had done my homework. And that was his MO from the start. There are no freebies with Walter Fritz. You had to do your homework. You had to come back to him and say, "Hey, look what I found." And then it's almost like a 180-degree turn. He wouldn't fight you on it. Once you had your evidence, he'd be like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, you know what? That's true. That did happen." And then he'll just change the subject and talk about something else. It's like there's no acknowledgement that for the last 3 times you talked to him, he lied flat out about it. Right. And it's it's almost like he's playing a cat and mouse game with you. It's like, "Oh, you've done your homework. Yeah, you got that one. Good for you." So it was an interesting, psychologically, that back and forth with Walter Fritz was really interesting for me.
I mean, to that extent, does he think that he's cleverer than other people? I mean, I pick up he's a difficult character to paint, and this is why I'd encourage everyone to read the book, because you see these fascinating variations in the way that he's responding to things and in his life history, because we do a little bit of his biography in the book, including this really tragic allegation from when he was 9 years old about getting abused by a priest, and which you also investigate. I found that actually very compelling reading, actually, and that you did your due diligence there, checking where this, going to the place where he said the abuse happened and so on. I found that very compelling and incredibly sad.
Yeah. No, I think Walter Fritz is someone, again, I don't settle the question on whether the abuse happened, although I do investigate it, and there's certainly credible evidence for his story. And this, of course, might provide a kind of motive. Why would someone whose life had been wrecked or certainly damaged by being abused by a priest as a kid would some might say quite justifiably like to produce a piece of ancient seeming history that questions one of the bases of one of the rationales for priestly celibacy, which some critics blame, at least in part, for the scourge of child sex abuse by priests.
Right.
But he is someone who also has always felt somewhat superior. He's had a chip on his shoulder. He's a very bright guy, and even as his half sister told me when we met in Germany, he's always someone who's wanted to present himself as bigger than he actually is. And so, and he talked about this honestly with me. He said, one of the, we talked about it with me. Again, it's hard to determine honesty, but he did talk about that. And I asked about, well, what, if you were, you say you were abused by a priest, what were some of the after effects of that in the rest of your life? And he said one of them was this sort of arrogance, this desire to show people that they weren't as smart as they were. And he says, I'm very, something like, I'm really good with words. I know what to say to hurt people. I'm really good at identifying the one thing that'll hurt them the most. And that's been a problem and something I've been working on. He said he's been turning to meditation, Eastern philosophies and religions to sort of try to get a handle on some of that. And he said that he's gotten a handle on a lot of it. But there's no question that he's someone who relishes being a little bit smarter than everybody else. And you can see it even in the responses. When I first called him in 2015, when I was in Florida, when I said that I had written for the Smithsonian Magazine, his response was, "You write for The Onion?" I'm pretty sure that he heard Smithsonian Magazine, but he's playing a little game. He's playing I heard you, but I'm gonna tweak you. You write for a comedy magazine. Or when Lisa Wanksness of the Boston Globe called him, I think she was also sniffing around Walter Fritz. She hadn't published anything before I had, but when she called him, he'd also denied everything, and he played completely dumb. He said something like, "Jesus' girlfriend? I haven't heard that Jesus had a girlfriend." And again, that's that side of him, in my view, that's just a little bit superior to everybody else. He knows better than those Harvard professors. He knows better than those pesky journalists. He knows better than those scholars like Andrew Bernhardt or Christian Askland from what he called the University of Eastern Pee-Pee Land.
I love that. Yeah.
He's really contemptuous of people who have either status or certain kind of hard-won scholarly knowledge. And perhaps it's no surprise. This is a guy who never made it in academia, who had dreams of being a success in Egyptology, wrote a paper that he thought was going to blow away the chairman of the Egyptology department at Free University. And then it has precisely the opposite effect. The chairman of the Egyptology department, who admittedly is not a particularly easy guy and was not particularly well liked, decided that Walter Fritz had plagiarized his ideas and wasn't going to be able to study with him there any longer. He might study with someone else, but he wasn't going to be like the darling of the Free University Egyptology department. And then, very soon after that clash with the professor, he washes out of the program. And so there are all sorts of ways. And again, I really feel it's a mistake as a writer to try to determine once and for all what somebody's motivation can be. It's really hard to stare into somebody's heart. But I do in the book try to set out, an array, a menu of compelling motivations, all of which maybe in concert may have led, if Walter Fritz did forge it, which he denies that he did, but if he did forge it, what may have led him to do so.
In the end, did you find that you kind of liked him?
I would say, I think it's dangerous to say that you like a source. I mean, I think all of us as journalists always have to retain a certain amount of remove from from our subjects. But were there aspects of speaking to him that I found enjoyable, intellectually stimulating? Absolutely. I mean, he's a fascinating guy to speak with. He's not like someone where you leave the conversation feeling distraught or hurt or emotionally broken down. And there are sources you talk to who will hurl a lot of verbal abuse at you. He didn't do that. Really not until the very end, I would say, not until the very end of the book writing process. And I'll tell you really the moment where there was a turn and when he decided he wasn't going to talk to me anymore, and where things did get a little bit more verbally confrontational. And that was, after I had filed a number of public record requests around Florida. And trying to figure out, I heard that he worked for a public agency in Florida. Florida has wonderful public records laws, and that served me and serves any Florida journalist very well. You don't have to be in Florida to use those public records laws. Anyone can use them. So I requested public records about him, any job applications he had filed, to a variety of public agencies, government agencies near where he lived in Gulf Coast, Florida. And one of the most interesting that came back were a bunch of job applications and resumes that he filed with the Sarasota County Schools. Sarasota, Florida is an important town on the Gulf Coast. And one of the documents that came back was when he was applying for a range of jobs with the schools. It was like he applied for everything. It was like everything from like janitor to classroom assistant to like some administrative position. He submitted a diploma from the Free University that said that Walter Fritz had a master's degree, a magister's degree in Egyptology. And I'm like, well, wait a second. I mean, right. Walter Fritz, and will tell you himself, he never graduated from the Free University. He got no degree from the Free University, yet staring at me in the face. I remember where I was on vacation. I think I was maybe I've been in Cape Cod at the time, sitting in the bed of a rented house, looking at this diploma that is a complete forgery. I mean, there's no way around it. He didn't get the degree. He'll be the first to tell you. And here it is, Walter Fritz, graduated the degree with a mark of Gut in Egyptology. Right. And I'm like, what is this thing? So I sort of asked some sources at the Free University, can you make sense of this for me? And they're like, yeah, this is interesting. The two professors who signed it at the bottom are not Egyptology professors, and they're not ancient history professors. These guys were professors in like the Department of Modern Eastern European History. Right. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is like this is an undeniable forgery that Walter Fritz submitted to a government agency in Florida, which, by the way, is a crime. If you in Florida to submit fake, anyone can forge anything. That's not a crime. Right. But once you use a forgery with the intent to defraud, and especially if you use educational credentials forgery in Florida with intent to defraud, that is a crime in Florida. So what became very clear to me was that Walter Fritz could swear up and down that he never forged the Gospel of Jesus' wife, that he didn't forge the provenance paperwork that he gave Dr. Karen King. But what he can no longer claim is that he is not a forger or that he works very closely with forgers. This is a public document obtained through an official request. And once he knew that I had that, he did something for the first time. When I asked him to comment on it, for the first time, he said he wouldn't comment. And for Walter Fritz, that was a signal moment, because he would talk and talk and talk and talk. He did not have an answer to why he submitted a forged Egyptology diploma to a government agency in Florida. And what fascinated me too was that this is the same MO. This is precisely the same MO that he uses on every single of his other forgeries, in my view, again, modern and ancient. So the Gospel of Jesus' wife, thanks to the work of Dr. Francis Watson and Andrew Bernhard, is now, almost by scholarly consensus, thought to be phrases cleverly cherry-picked from the Gospel of Thomas, then placed in a new order to say something new. It sounds like something old. It's essentially a cut and paste job. The provenance document that he gave Dr. King, that appeared to be signed by the Free University's Dr. Monroe, also appears to be a cut and paste job. He took 1990 stationery, typed another page that made it seem like it was from 1982, put that over the middle of the 1990 stationery, photocopied it, gave it to Dr. King. And now we see that the same MO. Now again, he's saying, I didn't forge the Monroe letter, I didn't forge the Gospel of Jesus' wife, but the same MO is used in the fake Egyptology diploma submitted to the Sarasota County Schools, which is you take an existing diploma that was probably given to somebody else, because he doesn't have any diploma from the Free University, given to someone else. He gets his hands on it. He puts new information in the middle, and then he photocopies and scans it and submits it to Florida. So the fact that you have the same MO in all these forgeries, I think, it makes a strong circumstantial case that
oh my goodness,
Walter Fritz forged it, or he knows who forged it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it absolutely fascinating that do you a lot of when, especially I would say in Acts 4 and 5 of the book, it's very visual. I find myself actually really with you on the journey. I mean, I don't mean this as a facetious question, but I could actually see a really awesome film being made of this. And my worry, if such a thing happened, is maybe sort of a younger Dustin Hoffman playing you would kind of work.
Gosh, I don't know.
but the thing is, the serious point of that is that if that does happen in a really strange way, Fritz has kind of succeeded in creating this modern day Da Vinci Code in real life story, hasn't he? I mean, he is in a way the author of this whole story, not just of that fragment, but in a real sense, he's the author of an extraordinary story that's just been playing out in front of us. And I think one of the reasons that I actually find myself, even though there are lots of moments of comedy in the book, in the end, it's a very sad story, a very tragic story, because I think people like me that have been involved in it since the beginning, and of course you and Andrew Bernhard and Christian Askeland and Francis Watts and other people, we actually in our own way have been manipulated by this guy. The very fact we have spent so much of our lives reflecting on this and talking about it is its own victory for him, I think, in a way. I mean, or is that not quite the right sort of way of thinking of it?
I mean, look, certainly Walter Fritz is someone who has craved attention and has craved recognition. And I think this is always a question that I think anyone who writes a true crime story, wrestles with. You're basically, one could be accused of, giving more publicity to someone who has craved it and has obtained that publicity through deception and through manipulation. I guess one of the things I try to tell myself, and I think is true, is that in trying to find answers to what would otherwise be this mystery, we're bringing a kind of resolution or a closure, not complete closure perhaps, but providing the kinds of answers that allow readers and scholars and just the lay public to put into context and to understand what went wrong here, in the hope that people who are approached by other con men or con artists in the future can look back on this and go, wait a second, we're recognizing the same pattern. And I don't think it does people any favors either to have a deception sort of linger in the public consciousness indefinitely. I think that in some ways also plays to the advantage, perhaps even more so, plays to the advantage of a Walter Fritz or someone trying to introduce a similarly dubious manuscript into the world, because Walter Fritz loves the idea he's still selling the idea that no matter what, I put something out there that people are going to have to debate forever. And I think what's good scholarship and what good journalism can do is to decide that there is no debate anymore. There's never no debate, but that the window for sort of robust debate over this has passed. So really, there's what winds up happening is that when you hear Walter Fritz continuing to make this point, when every single Coptic scholar and New Testament scholar in the world at this point says this thing is obviously a fake, is to sort of say, you're not going to be able to celebrate this as this this phenomenal discovery anymore. Again, as a journalist, I'm really there to try to just simply seek the truth and tell a story that I hope educates and entertains people. And maybe if people take a lesson away from that, that's great. But I think there is the idea of bringing closure to something. There's a value to that, both for the people whose lives have been overturned by it. And I will tell you that I've gotten calls from people inside Harvard saying thank you. This had been hanging over us for so long. And we never really felt like we had the answers we needed to have to move past this. We now have some of those answers, and thanks to you and thanks to some of the other scholars who have contributed to understanding this thing. So even from inside Harvard, there are people saying, there's a value to seeing this through to the end. What a movie will do, I'm not sure. I mean, I think there was one sort of commenter, this is not something I said, but some commenter, I think on the Atlantic piece, who said of Walter Fritz, I bet he confesses if he gets film rights. So,
Yeah.
Whether he will or not, I think he really enjoys, again, he is denied forging it, and I need to say that clearly. But if he did forge it, and I think there's a strong circumstantial case to be made that either he did or he knows who did, then he's having a ball with, the attention it's getting.
Yeah,
and I think the extent to which, a movie, if there were a movie made of it, really gets it right. I think that's what what it'll depend on. And I think I would want to be involved in any, if it does get made into a movie, I don't know who will. I would wanted to be involved in that process to make sure that it doesn't get twisted into another Da Vinci Code, but it tells a quite different story.
Right. I hope so. Yeah, agreed. I'm encouraged by what you say about Harvard, because one of the things I think was frustrating for people like me living through the thing was that a lot of the public pronouncements, especially in 2014, when we had scientific testing declares this authentic, or words to that effect, right up there on the Harvard Divinity School website. A lot of us found that, I'll be frank, very frustrating, because we knew that this thing was a forgery. There was absolutely no chance, given what we had seen about, this very clearly, that this fragment has got a typo on it from an internet interlinear of the Gospel of Thomas. There was just no way that it was that this thing, and that's just one of many things. And it was really frustrating at the time, having really feeling like we were not actually being heard at all. I mean, that's how it seemed back then. So it's kind of nice to hear that, because obviously it is an embarrassing thing for them, and for Harvard Theological Review as well. It's not it's not been a glory day for them.
No, and I think that's the big outstanding question that has not been answered. So it's fine for Harvard person here and there to call me up or to email me, but the question is, what are they going to do publicly? And I think that's still unresolved. I mean, the book breaks a lot of news, particularly about the corner cutting at the Harvard Theological Review, the use of Karen King's use of scientists who had sharp conflicts of interest that they did not disclose.
Yeah, that was staggering.
Shows either to the Harvard Theological Review or the public. So much of the science she used to claim that this might be authentic was produced by scientists, excellent scientists, but who were not archaeological scientists, who had never before worked with ancient manuscripts. One of them was a close family friend of Dr. Karen King's from childhood, an MIT professor, very close family friend, socializes with a lot. The other was the brother-in-law of Dr. Roger Bagnall, who, even before it was published, has taken stances in a documentary that it was probably authentic. So you have two people whose reputations were already bound up with authenticity, who mobilized their own either brothers-in-law or close family friends to do the science that Karen King would rely on to make this new announcement in 2014 and this publication in the Harvard Theological Review. And these were sharply conflicted scientists. And this is, you don't have to be a scholar to know that if there is a conflict of interest, at the very least, you need to disclose it. So that people evaluating your science go, okay, well, this is interesting science, but this person is a brother-in-law of someone who already took a public position.
Right, absolutely.
This person was an usher at Dr. Karen King's wedding.
Right.
So that's important information to know. So now the question is, what is the Harvard Theological Review going to do? In response to this, this is from my reading of the ethics policy of the Cambridge University Press, which publishes Harvard Theological Review. This appears to be a textbook violation of publishing ethics. So is the Harvard Theological Review going to do anything in response? And to date, they haven't announced anything. And and then the other question is this website that you mentioned. You're familiar with it. It's Harvard Divinity School's official Gospel Reviews website. It's still up there. It's still public facing. And it doesn't even have the statement from the dean of the Divinity School on it anymore that said, Dr. Karen King believes this is now a probable forgery. So I just wonder, is the Harvard Divinity School still, why is this public-facing website still presenting information that isn't current?
Right.
I mean, Dr. King doesn't. I mean, unless she's changed her mind again, I don't know. They no longer believes it's authentic. She believes it's a probable fake. And the science that is showcased on this public-facing website was written by people with sharp conflicts of interest. And those conflicts of interest, now they're publicly known, but they're still not reflected on the website. So you have a version of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife story on Harvard Divinity School's public-facing website that doesn't reflect the opinion either of Dr. King or of even one of the scientists whose work is being showcased there. And I just wonder again, this is the tricky thing when your own institution is vetting your own work. I mean, that itself, scholars have pointed out, I think Dr. Brent Nungri's pointed out, that itself is a very tricky position to be in, to have the Harvard Theological Review, which is edited by Harvard Divinity School professors, vetting the work of another high-ranking scholar within your own institution. So the question is whether Harvard how they will respond, and if they will respond to these new disclosures about the conflicts of interest that are evident or they're present in this 2014 article that Dr. King wrote for the Harvard Theological Review. I don't know, your own thoughts on that, but it seems to be something that scholars have asked me about, certainly.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I was in a way almost as flabbergasted when they removed the statement about the probable forgery, as I had been when they stated earlier that scientific tests had proved it authentic. I mean, those were. I mean, when one goes to it now, that there's this is very vanilla, but I mean, it's still there. There is no hint at all that this is unanimous. I think. No, don't know if I can say unanimously, but certainly the consensus of scholarship is that it's a forgery. So I agree. I want to see something on that. I wanted to I mean, we're running out of time, but if I may, just a couple of quick things I'd love to ask you about.
Sure.
In some respects, one of the most poignant moments, and I think this is the first time I've ever experienced this in a book, one of the most poignant moments is when in the page about sources right at the end of the book, you say that actually, although you talked to Karen King a lot at earlier points, you didn't actually have any feedback from her in relation to the book. So
right.
She turned down requests for interviews and things like that. That was to me rather sad and rather poignant at the end, because other voices like Anne-Marie Lyondike, like Roger Bagnall, do appear in the book, in the post 2016 sort of context. So I mean, that must have made the job harder in many respects, because you must have been thinking, well, I wonder what Dr. King would say about this, I wonder what she'd say about that, and so on.
Yeah, no, really good question. I really try to, I don't play games with sources. As a longtime journalist, if I have a story that's going to involve a certain source, I reach out right at the beginning, especially on a book length project, to say, hey, I'm writing this book. It's going to be about the rise and fall of this papyrus fragment. And I wrote to her as soon as I got the book contract back in 2016. I said, right away, I said, I've got a contract. Here's the book publisher. And I'd really like to be able to talk to you from time to time, meet with you, to make sure you have a chance to respond to everything, that I'm able to tell your story accurately with all the facts, and very cordial, open-minded letter saying I'd love to just sit down and work around your schedule whenever you're available over the next few years as I work on this. It wouldn't have been a massive commitment of time, but from time to time, maybe once a year, we could have a conversation. And didn't get any response to that at all. Then basically every year in the course of my reporting, I'd write her again. I'd often be both through multiple email addresses, certified letters to her office and home, and never got a response. And she knew I was working on the book because I ran into her at a conference, the Society of Biblical Literature, and we talked. She said something about it briefly, but she did not want to participate. It was clear she did not want to participate in the writing or even the vetting of the book. And even at the very end, when I'd reached the point where we had basically a manuscript ready to be sent to the publisher, I said, "Look, I've written a manuscript. I would like to fact check every detail with you that concerns you or your life or your work." And, this would be an opportunity that I think most people, even if they feel like the book is a book they'd perhaps rather not have written at all, would feel like, okay, at least I'll be able to, if there's any major errors, I'll be able to at least set this author straight. And even that didn't get a response. And then I went back to her one more time at the very end and said, here are some of the greatest findings they're one of the most sort of damning findings, I guess is one way to put them. The findings that would raise certain questions, including the ones about the conflict of interest, including the ones about why she suddenly switched in October of 2011 from a position of, I believe this is a fake and I'm not going to help you, go away, Walter Fritz, to all of a sudden deciding that she was going to take this on really abruptly. And I don't want to ruin any spoilers for readers, but if you look at the timeline of when she decides to take on the papyrus after formally telling Fritz to pound sand and that it wasn't authentic, that's an interesting question it raises. And I sent those to her in a list, and I said, I would love, if there's anything wrong about this, let me know. Take a week to do it, whatever you need, a week. I forget how many days we gave her, but it was certainly plenty of time. And there was no response. Called her, left voice messages, certified letters, emails, no response at all. And I do think that's, I just wonder. I wonder why someone would, turn down an opportunity like that when in none of my prior communications with her had she raised any objections to my reporting. If anything, it was quite the opposite. After the 2012 story and after the 2016 story, she said that my work has been really valuable. So I really don't understand it. And I think only Dr. King could give you an answer for why she didn't want to even sort of try to argue with any of the facts that I turned out.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, and one last thing, I'd love to ask what your next project is. That lots of us have read will have read your piece on supposed first century Mark and Dirk Obbink from Oxford. Is that something you're going to do any more work on, or have you got something else exciting in the works?
As an investigative reporter, I don't talk too much about
Sure.
upcoming projects, but I can tell you that one area that continues to fascinate me is the intersection between the ancient and the modern worlds. It's something that probably comes to me, congenitally. My father's was a professor emeritus of Near Eastern languages at UCLA. He's a native speaker of Aramaic, which is thought to be the language of Jesus. He grew up in a community of Aramaic-speaking Jews in the mountains of Kurdish Iraq. And so the way in which the collisions between the ancient world and the modern one, which I think both the Dirk Obbink story, Hobby Lobby story, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, how do we use the past to make arguments about the present? And how do what are the uses of the past today, and how does that sometimes apparently get people in trouble when their efforts to kind of weaponize the antiquity, or to weaponize manuscripts from antiquity to try to make arguments today for which there might be, maybe perhaps stronger moral present day arguments. You don't need to sort of reach back that far to make a compelling argument. So those things, that's a sort of what I'd call like a theme of the kinds of stories that certainly are intellectually stimulating to me. I don't ever, I go to every story sort of with eyes wide open, but I like thinking about the past, and I like writing about the past and how it continues to shape the present for better and for worse. Because there's a lot of wonderful scholarship, good scholarship that tells us all kinds of fascinating things about how people lived in antiquity that are great for people to know now, especially when people on the other side who haven't done their homework are trying to tell us that the past unfolded in a different way. So all of that really fascinates me, and I suspect I'll be doing more stories in that sort of space.
And to be fair, that is very much at the heart of Karen King's own project, that she is fascinated about discourses, about how discourses about the past impact and have relevance to our discussions today. So maybe maybe her voice actually in the end does come through in a strong way in that these are really important questions, and questions about the role of women in the history of Christianity, the way in which the church has treated women. These things are not things that you can look at in a vacuum, and one has to sort of look at them in relation to.
And to her credit, I mean, again, that is absolutely critical work, and I think one of the reasons she tries to draw on the past to make some of her arguments is that she'll argue that, well, the church does that. So if the church is claiming that its version of history is historically rooted, then part of what I can do is find evidence that the story it tells is not rooted in history. And so everyone's kind of playing with history here. And so the question is, the church absolutely has done this. I mean, and so again, I'm a journalist, but having read enough in this area, there's sort of plenty of places where, the Roman Catholic Church and other Orthodox churches have sort of bent history or manipulated evidence in ways that serve their own present day agendas. This is not something that is the province of one side, either the Orthodox or the progressive side of any faith. I mean, what fascinates me is that it happens on both sides. And if you're going to make the argument that the church has perverted the evidence or has twisted it, then I think it's incumbent that that it seems like it would be incumbent that you have one's own scholarship, especially as it concerns previously unknown ancient texts, have a very, very high level of a high bar of scrutiny and kind of and evidence. It's sort of like this notion that sensational claims require sensational evidence, or I forget the exact phrase. But that you have to have a very high bar, and it seems like in this case, again, this is what fascinates me, because Dr. Karen King had a history of publishing very well regarded scholarship, particularly in interpretive scholarship, interpreting text, not papyrology, not newfound previously unknown text, but as an interpreter of text, her work was really highly respected. So the question is, what happens when the tools that one uses to interpret text, and I do highlight this at the end, sort of postmodern readings of ancient texts, because I think, again, this is someone who studied postmodernism quite closely as an undergraduate. It was actually part of my major. I'm not someone who's coming at this completely new. There are ways in which postmodern readings and postmodern interpretations of text are absolutely valuable and fascinating. The idea that a reader reading a biblical text in one era in one part of the world could draw completely different, highly personalized meanings from it that are just as valid as someone else reading it in another part of the world in another era. I think that's great. I think it's really fascinating research. Where I think that there might have been some bleeding in this case is that there was a bleeding between the postmodern uses of literary analysis and then the methods of historical investigation. And so if you think that, it's one thing to say that we all have our own truths when it comes to an interpretation of text. But for me anyway, like the question of whether the gospel of Jesus' life actually existed in antiquity, in the form, actually existed in antiquity, there's only one answer. Either it did or it didn't. There's not like you have your truth and I have my truth, or the truth doesn't matter. It's just an interesting conversation piece. And I think that there may have been a little bit of slippage. And this is, again, I realize that Dr. Karen King, other people may read this differently. This is my opinion. It's presented as such in the book. But to me, there seems to be a slippage between the way she interprets texts and the methods of historical investigation and scientific investigation that she set forth in presenting this to the world.
Right, absolutely. And really, at the end of the day, we don't want in the academy to have doctoral students working on this for the next 20 years. And I think, more than anything else, your work and the work of others has saved us from that fate. But we're time's up, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Ariel Sabar, for this conversation. And thank you so much for writing such a well-researched, compelling narrative. I should let me do the full plug. The book is called Veritas: A Harvard Professor, a Con Man, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, and it is out now, and I strongly recommend it.
Thanks so much, Dr. Goodacre. I appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure to talk to you. Well, thanks for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always good to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, or just go over to Apple Podcasts and search for the NT Pod. Follow me on Twitter at Goodacre, or look at the Facebook page, which is just called NT Pod. I look forward to being with you again soon. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.